Once again, from the Temple in Independence, Missouri, welcome to CIMM Sessions, our little bite-sized servings of theology, culture, and community of Christ, identity, mission, message, and beliefs. Again, I'm David Lloyd, the director of the CIMM program here at the Graceland and Community of Christ Seminary. And we come to you again tonight with another fascinating topic that hopefully you'll enjoy as we share together. As we look over our enduring principles, the ones that continue to be a little bit problematic are the pursuit of peace, and how do we do that in our congregations, and how do we together make responsible choices? And in doing that, how do we also still affirm those people on the other side of our opinion in the worth of all persons? Well, we're going to be talking a little bit about that tonight with Kelly Phipps. Kelly joins us from Lee Summit, Missouri, and Kelly is a university professor with Rockhurst. He has worked with Common Consent Team at the World Conferences and also consulted during the national conferences in ways of reaching common consent. Kelly has served in the church for a number of years, was the former young adult minister here at headquarters, and he's going to be joining us for a two-part series. This is part one on deciding together in the church. So again, welcome everyone, and Kelly, I turn it over to you.
Terrific. Thanks, David. I appreciate the introduction. So I'm delighted to be here talking with you tonight about collaborative decision-making in the church. I know for most people, decision-making in churches is not something they would get excited about, but for me, it's something that I always enjoy talking about. I teach courses where I work with organizational leaders to figure out how to engage in collaborative decision-making. And that's a fun exercise. But anytime I get to do that same sort of education with faith-based leaders, it's especially exciting for me. Because the reason I'm passionate about collaborative decision-making is I believe it's consistent with our mission as Christians and as peacemakers. So a little bit of overview about how I've divided out my talk for the next couple of sessions. Today, I'm going to talk to you about the principles behind collaborative decision-making in churches. And I'm going to introduce you to 6 steps that can help with that process. Next week, for session 2, I'll walk through a hypothetical example using the 6 steps, so you can get a very hands-on example of what this would look like if a congregation or small group wanted to apply these steps. So I said next week is hypothetical, but I find that talking about collaborative decision-making can sometimes get kind of abstract. So I want to start with a story. So this is a story about a congregation I worked with years ago. I won't give you too many details, but they had a challenging decision facing them. And it became pretty evident that they were divided down the middle. It was about half the group wanted to go in one direction, another half wanted to go in the opposite direction. And so, as often happens in groups, sort of camps formed, and there was a lot of advocacy for one direction or another. I ended up working with the group because the pastor wanted some help thinking through how to manage this conflict. Eventually, the group, they held some open sessions. Eventually, they put it to a vote, and it was about a 51 to 49% split. And after that vote, the 49% stood up and walked out. And the pastor was distraught about how that had played out, and rightfully so. I totally understand why that was upsetting. But in retrospect, how he went about structuring the decision-making process further deepened those divisions. And so what I want to talk about tonight are the principles of how we can engage in decision-making in ways that doesn't deepen our division, but brings us together. So that's what I want to talk about tonight. And we're going to talk tonight mostly about principles. And again, next week, we'll talk about, we'll apply those principles to a specific example. So let's start with the principles. To do that, we need to talk first about why I think collaboration in decision-making is important. In Community of Christ, one of our enduring principles is blessings of community. So for me, that principle speaks to our core belief that Christianity isn't just a solo endeavor. It's not just about what we personally believe, but rather it's something that when we personally believe, we act that out together in community. So being a follower of Christ means that we are helping to build God's peaceable kingdom here today. But in practice, we all know that anytime you get a group of diverse people together, there's likely to be some division in that group. So what do we do when members of that community disagree with one another? So another one of our enduring principles is unity in diversity. That's another way of saying that we acknowledge that members of our community may see things differently, but we're committed to remaining in community even when we don't agree. Now, that's a great principle, but in practice, the tension between our desire for unity and the reality of our diversity can sometimes leave us feeling like we're not living up to our calling. But I personally believe that tension between unity and diversity is central to our calling as a faith community. How we make decisions together when we disagree is a part of our witness to the larger world. By engaging one another in ways that honor all perspectives and model a way of proceeding that's different from what the rest of the world models, that's a part of how we witness our belief system to the rest of the world. And I believe, personally, that we are, as a faith community, uniquely positioned to model unity and diversity. We've got a couple of things really working in our favor. The first one is that we're diverse enough to be a microcosm of the larger culture and world. However, we're also small enough to really know one another and listen to one another. And those two working together, the breadth of our diversity and the depth of our relationships, really positions us well to be able to model unity and diversity. So what I want to share with you are some suggestions about how we can do that together. So if the way we make decisions when we disagree models for the rest of the world a different way, that's a really important part of our witness. But I want to be clear, just because it's a part of our calling or our witness, that doesn't make it easy. Decision-making in churches, you all know, can be very challenging. We've all experienced some of those challenges. So I spent some time contemplating why that is so difficult. And part of the reason I think about that is I work with organizational leaders all the time about decision-making in their organizations, but they don't face nearly the challenges that churches do. So I've spent some time thinking about what is so different about church that makes decision-making challenging. So I'm going to share kind of my take on that. This isn't based on any research other than things I've read. It's mostly just my observations, and I'm sure you could add to this list. But the first one is in churches, we tend to have lots of allegiances and friendships, which can make it very difficult when we find ourselves on opposite sides of an issue, especially when we're on opposite sides from our family or friends. And so the depth of relationships in churches sometimes makes those conflicts or those differences of opinion particularly challenging. Second reason is that the topics under consideration may be very passionately held by people. I sometimes joke, if I go to a doctor's office and I sit in the lobby, I don't really care what color the chairs are in the lobby, but you switch that question to a church sanctuary, and I may suddenly care very passionately about the color of those chairs. particularly if I'm a donor or if I'm deeply invested in that community and the way the building appears. I specifically didn't tell you what the conflict was in that first story I told you, but statistically speaking, chances are it was a conflict of something about the facility. That's where I see most conflicts in churches. Color of pews, color of chairs, color of carpet, whether to build on, whether to sell a building, build a building. There's something about our buildings that tends to bring out a wide array of perspectives that are understandably passionately held. Another reason that I think decision making in churches can be challenging is that we sometimes buy into this narrative that tells us that if there's any disagreement in our church, that it's somehow a sign of failure or dysfunction. In reality, I've never found an organization that didn't have some disagreement within it. Not for lack of trying, I've looked, but I've never been able to find an organization that didn't have some level of disagreement among its members. And so when we set unrealistic expectations about unity within our membership, it can sometimes cause us to hide or pretend so that we can have the illusion of unity without necessarily having to do the hard work. Another reason that making decisions in churches can be challenging is that churches are fundamentally different than other types of organizations, particularly when it comes to decision making. If I'm at work and a decision is made and I don't like it, I'm probably not going to quit my job over it, mostly just because I kind of like having a job. It's not that important to me. But in reality, and many times that's what happens in churches. In churches, if people are unhappy with a decision, they can leave. They can vote with their feet. And so making a decision that's divisive or controversial can sometimes feel like a very high stakes decision. And as a result of those high stakes, it can cause the group to avoid the decision or work around it for too long out of a fear that it will cause division within the group. So when I first began working with churches involved in conflicted decision making, I noticed two big needs. The first one had to do with the leader. So when I would meet with pastors or church leaders when there was a conflict going on, the leader would often emphasize for me that they knew the process was really important. They understood that the process that they followed would likely guide where they ended up in the outcome. But despite understanding how important it was, they often felt lost about what process to follow, partly because they had never really been taught or had modeled for them what processes might look like in that context. For most of us, the decision-making models we've grown up with have a lot to do with voting and advocacy. And so as a result, these leaders that I was meeting with knew those tools didn't really fit the question, but they didn't have other tools to fall back on. So that was the first need I saw, was a need for some guidance on process. The second need I witnessed when I started getting into these congregations had to do with the members. So when I would sit down and talk with members about how they were experiencing the decision making, they often talked about how they were hearing lots of voices, but they tended to be the same voices over and over speaking to the issue. And so the members really didn't have a very good sense of where the rest of the congregation stood on the issue. They knew where 3 or 4 or 5 people stood because they had been very vocal. And the people they were hearing from tended to be on the most polar extremes of the question, either fully in favor or fully opposed. And so the members found themselves really sort of in the dark, knowing how a few people felt, but really not knowing how the rest of their fellow members felt about the issue. So the process I'm going to share with you today is meant to address both of those concerns. The leader's need for a clear process to follow, and the members' need to hear from those who may be silent. The process I'm going to share is meant to address both of those concerns, a need for a process and the desire to hear from those who are silent. So sometimes when I describe this process to people, I describe it as a map and a mirror. It's a map in the way that it lays out the questions to be addressed together, and it's a series of steps that the group can consider in order. And as you work your way through that process, it also serves as a mirror. It holds a mirror up to the community so that they can see how others are thinking about the issue at hand. So it's a map and a mirror, but it's not a fix-it solution for leaders. It's not going to make the problem go away. It's not going to give you a magical answer, but rather it's a guide for how a community can work together toward a solution that reflects the wisdom of the group. So the process is actually built around two primary changes from how we typically make decisions. I referenced those leaders, those congregational leaders, and I said, we often don't have good models to fall back on, and that's not a criticism of anyone. Most of us didn't grow up with great models for how to engage in collaborative decision making. So this model is built around two changes from what we typically see in our culture about how to make decisions. The first change has to do with the choices we offer. Most decision making in Western cultures is premised on a binary choice, for or against, yes or no. But the research on how people actually think about problems suggests that most people tend to hold a much more nuanced perspective. Very few people are 100% in favor or 100% opposed. They may have support, but with some reservations, or they may be conflicted. So when we restrict our information gathering to just yes or no, it gives us a very incomplete picture of where people are. So that's the first change, moving away from just yes or no. The second challenge has to do with what we focus on. So there's a body of research that suggests that when you've got a problem in front of you, where you begin the discussion is highly predictive of where the outcome lands. So in other words, if I've got a proposal in front of me and I begin with, are you in favor or are you opposed? I'm likely to end up with an impasse or a division split down the middle. But if the conversation begins by focusing not on yes or no, but on why people feel that way, we're far more likely to end up with a collaborative outcome. So where we begin the conversation is important. And if we begin the conversation with focusing on why instead of yes or no, we're setting the group up to be able to collaborate. So if our objective is to understand and learn from one another, we need to shift our conversation to why we feel the way we do, rather than whether we will vote yes or no. So the steps of this process are designed to move people into a conversation about why they feel the way they do, and do so in a sequence that invites learning rather than vote counting. So I keep referencing the process, and I apologize, I keep referencing it, but I haven't shared it with you. So I'm going to do that now. And just a reminder, what I'm going to share with you are 6 steps, and I'm just going to work my way through the steps now. But next week, I'm going to go through those steps in much greater detail and give you an example. But today, my goal is to just introduce you to the steps. So one of the things that's a little confusing is I refer to them as steps, but each step is a question. And let me explain why that is. It's a step because they move in order. You move first step one, then step two. When you are on each step, the task for the congregation or the leader is to engage the group in in answering that question together. So I'm going to share some slides now and show you those 6 steps, and we'll work our way through them together. So there we go. So the first step is what perspectives are held within the group on this proposal. So remember, and I'm going to try to link these back to some of what I just shared. I want to point out for you what I'm really doing here is we're starting with why. Anytime there's a proposal in front of a group, the first thing people want to do is they want to know what are its chances of passage, how many people like it, how many people don't like it. And what I'm doing is here in this first question is we're starting with the question, tell me about why. Tell me your why. So when I say perspectives, I mean the easiest way to think about what is a perspective. If you told me I'm against this proposal and I said why, what you share next is your perspective. So the perspective is not what we want to have happen, it's our reason behind. And in most cases, perspectives are informed deeply by our life experience. There's a reason we like something or don't like something. It's based on our values or what's happened to us or our hopes or aspirations. And so the perspectives that people share are their why. And we're starting there. So that's the first step, first question for the group. Once the group has gathered all those perspectives, the next question or the next step is how widely are those perspectives held within the group? Now, again, to link back to what I said earlier, this one here is an attempt to address that dynamic where we've only heard from the polar extremes. So the polar extremes, those are valid perspectives. We need to include those. But in this stage, we're going to find out how many people really feel that way. And when you engage in, when you're on this step, it's not just about pick one. You can pick as many of them as you agree with. And so in practice, what that means is people will say, well, I agree with these 4 or 5 perspectives. And what it does is when you look at the results of that, you get a real sense of what the group is feeling together. And it may be conflicted, it may be messy, and that's just fine. But what you're doing is you're learning from one another in a way that's not possible by just having an open mic session. So that's the second step. How widely are those perspectives held? The third step is what level of support is there for the proposal in its current form? Now you'll notice that we did finally get to this question. It's the question everyone wants to start with, but the research about how people communicate, and particularly in small groups, suggests that if you start with this question, people will not share their responses to the first 2 questions. Particularly if what they learn is that their perspective is in the minority. Once people learn they're in the minority, there's a social pressure to go along, to not make waves. And so those people that are silent will likely stay silent. So this question, how much support is there, is delayed until much later. Additionally, we're not asking, are you for or against? We're asking people to tell us their level of support. And that level of support is on a scale. I often use 1 to 5. And so by telling me on a scale of 1 to 5 how much support they have, I get a sense of whether there's still things we need to be talking about and exploring, or whether the group has pretty much made up its mind. And everybody gets that information all at the same time. So collectively, we're learning as we go through this process. The fourth question is a really important question, but a kind of a complicated question. The fourth question is, what are the primary reasons for your level of support? So one of the things I've learned over the years is that if someone is on the opposite side of an issue from me, and I don't know why they're on the opposite side of the issue. I know why let's say I'm in favor of something. I know why I'm in favor, but all I know about them is they're opposed to it. There's a part of my brain that likes to fill in gaps. So if I know they're opposed, but I don't know why they're opposed, my brain is likely to fill in that their reason for being opposed is the opposite of my reason for being in favor. So if I'm in favor because I want the congregation to grow and they're opposed, then they must want the congregation to shrink. Well, that's not really fair, is it? But if I don't have any other information to answer that question, it's very easy to fill it in with whatever my suspicions are. So this question is an attempt at letting those in each level of support speak for themselves. Now, it's an imperfect way of doing it, particularly when we're doing it in large groups, but it's at least an attempt to say, for those people who are fully supportive, what are their reasons? What's their why? And once we have a better understanding of that, we can begin to understand what people are trying to accomplish. So that's question 4. Question 5 is, what concerns are limiting your support for the proposal? So if a group has a proposal in front of them, and we've already learned that there's not full support for it, chances are people have some things they'd like to see change. This is an opportunity for the group to really focus its attention on not just what would you do differently, but what's limiting your support, what's holding you back. And the idea here is that a group of people can then take this list of concerns and work their hardest to try to refine the proposal to make it stronger, to gain more support from the group. And the last question is kind of a wrap-up question. Is the group ready to make a decision? So this question is really about the fact that every group has to reach a point where they decide, are we going to keep talking about this? Are we going to keep improving it? Or are we ready to either vote it up or vote it down? And so this question is really an acknowledgement that at some point the group decides we're ready to make a decision. And so when the group is ready, they can move into a voting posture. But the idea is that we keep a clean line between when we're in the listening stage and when we're in voting stage. So we do some things here that might look like voting, but they're actually, I think of them more as surveys or polls than voting, because they're to gather information, not to make decisions. So those are the 6 steps of the process. As you might imagine, working through all 6 steps of the group is a pretty big commitment of time and energy. I'm going to stop sharing here for a moment. Like as I said, it's a pretty big commitment of time and energy to work your way through all of those 6 steps as a group. So the way I describe this to people is I think of collaborative decision making as a limited resource. It's something that's very useful, very valuable, but something that should be used when it can make the greatest difference. So that raises a question: when should a group use a process like this? So there's a few considerations, and it's really, I probably boil it down to three considerations. First one is whether the group is ready for it. Second, whether there's a diversity of perspectives. And third, whether a decision from the group is best. Let me work my way through those. First one, so again, the question is, when should a group use the 6 steps? So is the group ready? When groups are facing challenging decisions, sometimes they can find themselves considering lots of directions at the same time. You've all probably been in a group like that, where if you've got 3 or 4 people all pitching their ideas and everybody's kind of advocating for what they think should happen next. When there's division in the group like that, there can be a lot of opinions about how to proceed. And listening carefully to one another can get really challenging when you're not all talking about the same thing. So if one side's advocating we move in this direction and the other side's advocating we move in another direction, it can get really easy to start talking past one another. So for that reason, I tell people this process works best when a group has a specific proposal in front of them for consideration. Now, when I say proposal, I don't necessarily mean that it has to be in final form or the very best possible version of the proposal. But what's important is that everyone is considering the same question. So that's the first answer to the question, who should use this? It should be a group that has a specific proposal under consideration. The second factor to think about is whether there's a diversity of perspectives on the proposal. As I said earlier, collaborative decision-making is a limited resource, takes a lot of resources. So before we make that kind of an investment, we should make sure that the topic at hand is important enough to merit that investment of time and energy. If the proposal before the group is one that really doesn't have a lot of diversity of perspectives, it may not be worth going through the 6 steps. But if there is a variety of perspectives, taking the time to listen to those is likely a worthwhile investment of time. So the third consideration is whether the group would benefit from reaching a decision together. So this is kind of a tricky one. A question every leader faces, any of you who have been in leadership roles knows that when you're in a leadership role, you've got to decide for every decision whether this is something that you should take to the group or whether you should make it yourself or with a smaller group. And there's a whole body of research around that question. And the research suggests that there's several factors to be considered when you're deciding, do I make the decision myself, small group, or bring it to the whole group? One of the factors you've got to think about is whether you as the leader have expertise on that question. So if this is a matter that requires a deep level of expertise that only you have, maybe it's not a question for the whole group. Similarly, you have to ask yourself, what level of expertise does the group have? If this is something the group has expertise in, maybe it would be beneficial to take it to the group. But it's the third factor that research points to that's the most relevant here, and that is it's most relevant to a church context, that a leader might be able to select a decision that's optimal for the group, but if the group didn't participate, they may not accept it. So in other words, the likelihood of the group accepting a decision that's made without any opportunity for input, if the likelihood of acceptance is high, then it's probably okay to make that group, that decision in a small group or have the leader make it. But if the group is likely to not accept the decision without input, it's probably worth the investment of time. So in other words, what I'm saying is this process not only helps create a decision that's well thought out by using the wisdom of the group, but it also brings the group along in the process, which results in greater buy-in in the end. So Kind of my summary answer about when is it best to use this group, three things. There needs to be a specific proposal in front of the group on a matter of importance, a diversity of opinions about that proposal in the group, and a need for buy-in from the group. If those three things are true, it's probably worth the investment of time and energy to do something like these 6 steps. So I mentioned several times some of the research that informs this process. It might be helpful to tell you a little bit about where the 6 steps come from. I first started experimenting with some of these processes when I was executive director of a community mediation center. Around that same time, we did a lot of consulting with groups around decision making. Around that same time, I began my doctorate in leadership studies, and so I started reading lots of material about decision making in groups and leadership theory. And I began to see lots of connections between the research on effective leadership and what I had learned about what works well in collaborative decision making. And so I started experimenting with adding some of those components into the processes I was using. So over time, I've added pieces from my studies in organizational dynamics, decision making, qualitative research methodologies. And then eventually, when the Community of Christ was beginning to experiment with new processes at World Conference, I was fortunate to be a part of that team. And that process of experimentation is still ongoing today. So I should also point out that what I'm referring to here as the 6 steps may have other names. I'm doing that, using that name 6 steps just for simplicity tonight. When we use the 6 steps at World Conference, we've traditionally been referring to that as the common consent process. When I'm working with outside groups in my consulting work, I refer to the 6 steps as collaborative refinement, but they're essentially the same 6 steps. I needed to come up with a name different than common consent because that's a terminology that comes out of the history of our faith tradition. And when I'm working with non-faith groups or other faith traditions, I needed to have a non-sectarian title for the process. So when I talk about the common consent process, I'm actually referring to a collaborative decision-making process that's very much uses these 6 steps, but it's tailored to the needs of World Conference specifically. So over the years that we've been doing this at World Conference, folks have approached me and said, hey, could we do this in our congregation? And I sometimes have to chuckle to myself because I first started doing this with small groups. And then we had the challenge of how do we do this small group process with World Conference? And there's all kinds of challenges that we faced. Some of them are just kind of obvious. A large group, compressed agenda, limited time. Everything has to happen within 1 week. We're using polling devices, got multiple languages, headsets for translations. So all those complications, we had to sort of design the process around. But congregations and mission centers don't necessarily have all those constraints. So applying those 6 steps are likely going to look different in a local setting, and that's great. So some of the things I was doing with small groups were adapted to use in a large international group, and that was exciting, but really it's a whole lot easier to do this with a small group, particularly because you don't have the press of time, and you can do it, some of it spread out over time. So next week, I'm going to go into the 6 steps in much greater detail. I'm going to use a specific example, and for each step, I'll offer some suggestions about how you might implement those steps. However, just in full transparency, everything I'm going to talk about next week is I've written down, and it's available in a resource. That resource is titled Deciding Together. When congregations and mission centers started reaching out to me wanting assistance, I realized I probably needed to write some of this stuff down. And so I started with just kind of a brochure. It eventually grew into a big brochure. it's a small book or a big brochure. I'm not sure what to call it. It's around 40 pages. It's not riveting reading by any means. It's more of I think of it more as an instructor's guide, or I think I call it a leader's guide. It's it's what we'll be going through next week. Works its way through an example, gives some specific suggestions and tips for each of the steps. And that resource is available to all of you. I'm going to share my screen again. The advanced slides here real quick. So that resource is available on this website. It's called www.decidingtogether.org. The title of the book is Deciding Together. And when I wrote this, I considered publishing it through a publishing house, but I realized if I did that, everyone was going to have to pay for it. And I wanted to be able to give it away, which publishing houses frown upon. So I self-published it and put it out there on this website so that I can give it away to anybody I want. And so it's free to members and friends of Community of Christ. If you go to that website and click on purchase resource, when you go to check out, if you use this coupon code, C of Christ, it'll reduce the price to $0, and it's a free download, either an EPUB or PDF. So I get nothing out of this other than spreading the good word, because really my objective here is to get the idea out there that there's a better way to decide together. So as you probably can tell, collaborative decision-making is both a professional and a personal passion for me. If I think back on why that is, like where did that come from? It has a lot to do with what I learned growing up in this faith tradition. As I was growing up and through my young adult years, it was very clear to me that listening to one another and working together was a core part of our culture. I think of these 6 steps as a way of structuring conversations to make that possible, to support that culture. It's meant to be a decision-making process that enhances and fosters understanding instead of division. And when we're able to do that well, I believe we're faithfully modeling our own principle of unity and diversity. So that's why I care about it. So with that, I'm going to stop. I'll stop sharing the slides and switch it back to you, Dave.
Thank you so much, Kelly. Just a whole lot of information in a short amount of time there, and I'm glad we at least have you for 2 parts. Those of us who are leaders in our congregation or mission center know that this has been used in a number of different ways in difficult decision making. I guess that's the first question I have. And by the way, anyone who has a question for Kelly tonight, now's the time to go ahead and type it up in the chats, and we'll hopefully get to as many of you as possible. But for me, I'm thinking about the number of times in my life as a church leader we should have used something along this line to get through the process of understanding not only another way than just saying yes or no, but also hopefully getting us to a place where we understand what the issues are on the other side. And I think sometimes if we are open enough, we can be able to understand that these perspectives are worth our time to spend a little time with, to talk through. And of course, we wouldn't use this on everything in a congregational business meeting. No. You definitely wouldn't use it for an ordination call. You wouldn't use it on the finances necessarily unless it was a really pivotal issue. But there are a number of ways that we could use this on those things that especially could divide us. And I really liked how you said that our part of who we are is that we're diverse enough and we're also small enough to be able to have the opportunity to work through some of these problems, especially on a congregational level. This does take more time, doesn't it, Kelly?
It absolutely does take more time up front. Um,
Yes.
However, what I tell people is um, to not think, don't run the clock from the start of the conflict to a decision. Run the clock to include the time dealing with the division afterwards. And so oftentimes, if we reach a quick decision that divides the group, you may spend years
Yeah.
dealing with the conflict afterwards and the lost momentum when people are divided.
Uh, yeah, and sometimes not making a decision is making a decision. Um, yeah,
Right.
yeah, and I remember the some of the processes that we've used in mission centers and congregations are also the sticky notes, and the
Mhm.
putting the perspectives around the room and categorizing them in some way. I've learned as a leader that it was really important to get someone else to be able to frame those areas,
Mhm.
especially if I, as the leader, was invested in one side or the other.
Yep.
Because also part of this is to show that one of the complaints we get a lot of times is that the leadership is driving an agenda,
Right.
and and it's good. This also allows us to have the process of having other people there to record and to paraphrase and to to put out those perspectives without the leaders looking like they are driving one side or the other.
Mhm. Yeah.
Yeah, and again, that takes a lot of work to be able to line up the people beforehand to say, I know you can do this paraphrasing a lot better than I can. Can you take over this part and can take
Yeah.
each one of those six areas that you go through?
So there's a particular skill set to synthesizing ideas down and finding themes. Some people are really good at it. Some people it just doesn't come naturally. So if it's not a natural gift for you, finding someone that comes naturally for, usually a facilitator, a trained facilitator, is someone who can help you with that.
Yeah,
But anyone that can help you distill those themes down, and really I talk about this as something the leader drives, but ultimately, ideally it's a leadership team that's doing this. Uh,
right.
so it's
Yes.
a group of people with diverse skills helping guide through the process.
Well, and in a lot of cases, when I've gone through this process, a third way has emerged.
Yeah, exactly.
That neither side saw, but both sides see it as being the best outcome.
Yep.
And that's a wonderful that's a wonderful arrival when you think you're going to be butting heads, and all of a sudden you come together and you find a way that is different than what you originally thought.
But third ways are usually discovered when both sides understand each other's perspective for the first time.
Right. Right.
And so you can't get to that third way. There's no shortcut to it. You've got to
No.
make sure that both sides understand each other. And then it seems obvious. It always seems obvious in retrospect. When I'm facilitating a group, often there's a perception that I didn't do anything as a facilitator because people think they came upon these ideas themselves, which is a sign of a well facilitated group when they come to those ideas themselves.
Yeah. Well, and there's also I know for me, we can come into a situation where we're going to make a decision and immediately lodge ourselves into the side that we feel is the best side.
Right.
And how do we get into? So a lot of this is when we open the creative mind, we usually look at a multiplicity of ways, and that frees us to change our perspective sometimes.
Mhm.
So how do we get to that place in a situation like that where we are engaging our creative mind?
So I'll use an analogy here for a moment.
Okay.
When I first started teaching, one of the things I really didn't like was having to lay down all the rules in the
Yeah.
classroom. I didn't like being the bad guy. And what I discovered was if I put it all in the syllabus, then I could just hold the syllabus up and say, here's the rules. Sorry, they're in the syllabus. And then just move on because all the rules were in the syllabus. When a leader has a proposal that's out there, the leader doesn't have to necessarily advocate for the proposal. What the leader does is the leader says, here's our best version of the proposal. Now I'm curious how you all are going to respond. So the leader's not pushing the proposal. He or she is not trying to get you on board with it.
Right.
The proposal stands on its own, and the leader engages with curiosity amidst the group about how others are feeling about this proposal. They're not pushing it. They're not advocating it. They're not selling it. And so that's the power of this process is that the proposal stands on its own, and then everyone works together to try to improve it to represent the will of the group.
Yeah, that's great. That's great. You mentioned the. I've often said that we can have deep theological conversations and have deep-rooted theological divides among us, but when it comes to the color of the carpet in the sanctuary, we're going to have a fisticuffs.
Yes.
It's hilarious to think that these things that are not so solely connected to the mission of the church become the sticking points over which we have, family feuds.
Well, in some ways, it makes a lot of sense because those are matters of personal opinion. They're matters of personal preference. And so in many ways, it's about how you frame the question.
Right.
I was working with a congregation years ago, and they got snagged on that question. And so I changed the question for them. And instead of which would you prefer, the question was, which one would you choose first? Which one could you live with? And which ones do you most object to? And once everybody answered those questions, it was pretty clear. There was one that no one really objected to, and everything else was objectionable to somebody. And so the way you frame the question often, again, determines how people engage in the problem solving.
Right. And this is my last question, unless anyone else has a question, last chance, which leads me to my last question in regard to, it was always a challenge for me as a church leader to bring people back to the mission of the church. After all is said about the color of the carpet,
Right.
well, what does that have to do with the mission of Jesus Christ in our congregation? And it could very well. And so how do we approach that in those 6 steps? Where is the appropriate place to gather our heads back together and say, okay, where's the perspective in regard to how this relates to our congregational or denominational mission?
So I've got 2 answers to that. One is goes back to what I said initially, and that is how we engage in decision making together is a part of our witness. It even though the question of the color of whatever it is may not be that important, the way we treat one another, the way we value one another's opinions, the way we extend grace toward one another, those are expressions of who we are and how we live out our witness. The second answer to that is foreshadowing what I'm going to talk about next week. Next week, I'm going to work us through an illustration, but one of the questions I want to address before we finish is how the process of discernment interacts with this process.
There you go. Yeah.
Because that's a really important question, and it's honestly a question that that's a little challenging, so much so that I had to sit down with some discernment experts and sort of pick their brains, and they picked my brain, and we kind of tried to figure out where does each of these processes fit. And I'll just tell you up front, I think there's a place for both. It's a both and.
Yeah.
And so next week I'll talk more about when you might use discernment, when you might use this process, and when you might blend the two of them together. because there's nothing about these 6 steps that says you can't have spiritual practices in between. And in fact, when they're done really well in a church setting, that fits very nicely. I didn't include them in the 6 steps because a non-church organization wouldn't include those. But they absolutely can be included there, and we've got great examples of how to do that.
Which is a great segue to join us next week as Kelly presents part 2 of this, and we'll share together again on that. Thank you again, Kelly, for joining us this evening, and everyone who joined us around the world to CIMM Sessions, and we will be back next week with part 2.